One fateful night, the police pull over a black woman, framing her with fabricated evidence. They believe she's just another easy target, unaware that they've just set a trap for themselves. That woman is none other than the director of the FBI, someone with the power to dismantle their entire operation. As the truth explodes in court, those who once manipulated the law realize that justice cannot be silenced. Don't miss this intense story. Hit subscribe and like to stay updated on more shocking revelations. The night was supposed to be uneventful, but the officers waiting in the shadows had other plans. The woman in the black SUV had no idea she was about to become the centerpiece of a perfectly orchestrated takedown. Or so they thought. The patrol car had been parked for nearly an hour, strategically positioned near an intersection with a faded stop sign, an ideal trap. The two officers inside, veteran Sergeant Daniel Reese and his eager young partner Officer Jake Nolan, had been waiting for the right target. They needed someone who fit the narrative, someone who wouldn't be able to push back. When they spotted the black SUV cruising through, they barely waited for it to roll past before flipping on their lights. The sirens cut through the silence as the SUV pulled over. Reese smirked. Everything was going according to plan. He had done this before, countless times, and no one had ever fought back in a way that mattered. He adjusted his belt, his fingers grazing the small plastic bag in his pocket. Insurance, just in case things didn't go smoothly. Nolan swallowed hard beside him, eager but nervous. The driver's side window rolled down. A woman sat inside, composed and still waiting. Reese approached, flashlight beaming into the car. The woman didn't flinch. She just waited. He asked for her license and registration, and she handed them over without hesitation. Amara Johnson. The name meant nothing to him. Just another black woman on the wrong side of town at the wrong time. Reese played his role perfectly, pretending to scrutinize her documents while Nolan circled to the back of the vehicle. A moment later, his voice called out, pretending to have found something suspicious. Reese turned back to the driver, his expression darkening. He informed her that they had probable cause to search the vehicle. She didn't resist. That was the first sign something was wrong. Nolan popped the trunk, shining his flashlight inside. A small duffel bag sat near the edge, something that hadn't been there when she packed her car earlier that night. Reese made a show of reaching for it, unzipping it with deliberate slowness. Inside, a bag of white powder nestled in the folds of dark fabric. The perfect evidence. The perfect crime. Amara barely reacted. She glanced at the bag, then at the officers. Her expression remained unreadable. Reese announced that she was under arrest. Nolan moved in with the cuffs. But then she spoke. Her voice was steady, calm, almost amused. She wasn't pleading, wasn't arguing. She was stating a fact. And then she dropped the bombshell. She was the director of the FBI. Reese's smirk faltered. Nolan Frotze. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt sideways. Amara waited, watching them, gauging their reactions. She could see the calculations running through Reese's mind, the way his grip on her wrist tightened. His options were narrowing by the second. If he let her go, his career was over. If he doubled down, things could spiral beyond his control. Reese made his choice. He yanked her forward, snapping the cuffs around her wrists. Nolan hesitated but followed his lead. They had come too far to back down now. The only way out was through. They led her to the squad car, stuffing her inside with more force than necessary. Reese's mind was racing. The name. The face. He hadn't put it together, but now that she had said it, it was all clicking into place. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a disaster. As they pulled away, Amara remained silent in the back seat. Her gaze flicked to the mirror, watching them. She wasn't worried. She wasn't scared. She was calculating. And she knew something they didn't. The moment they brought her into the station, everything would start to unravel. The trap they had set for her had already begun to snap shut around them instead. Reese clenched the wheel, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his gut. This wasn't going to end the way they had planned. Amara Johnson sat motionless in the dimly lit holding cell, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her breathing steady. The metallic clang of the bars locking echoed through the corridor as the two arresting officers exchanged satisfied glances. They believed they had caught an unsuspecting woman in their well-laid trap, unaware that they had just put the director of the FBI in cuffs. The weight of their mistake hadn't hit them yet, but it was coming, and she was going to make sure of it. Outside the holding cell, the precinct was buzzing. Officers moved in and out, some curious, others indifferent. Inside the break room, Carter leaned against the counter, sipping his coffee, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. Sullivan sat across from him, his confidence growing as he replayed the arrest in his mind. To them, this was just another day, another arrest, another notch in their belt of unchecked authority. They had done this before, planted evidence, falsified reports, made sure the people they chose to target had no way out. But this time, they had picked the wrong target. In the observation room, a younger officer, Daniels, sat at his desk, eyes fixed on the live feed from the holding cell. Something about the woman's composure unsettled him. She wasn't reacting the way most suspects did. There was no panic, no pleading, just cold, calculated silence. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he pulled up her information, his pulse quickening as he read her full title. The realization hit him like a freight train. He turned his head toward the break room, where Carter and Sullivan laughed over their coffee. They had no idea what they had done. Amara's thoughts remained sharp. She had counted every step, catalogued every voice. She knew which officers were merely bystanders and which ones were active players in this corrupt precinct. She wasn't here to beg for justice. She was here to let them dig their own graves. The clock was ticking, and she knew reinforcements were coming. The only question was who would break first, the system or the men who thought they controlled it. Daniels took a deep breath and made his way to the captain's office. Captain Reynolds was an old-school officer, weary but sharp, someone who had learned to pick his battles. He barely looked up as Daniels entered, but when he heard the urgency in the young officer's voice, he finally shifted his gaze to the report on his screen. His eyes scanned the words, his face hardening. The room fell into silence. The weight of the situation was becoming clear. Back in the break room, Carter's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his smirk faltering. The message was short but damning. "You just arrested the FBI director." His fingers tensed around the cup. He looked at Sullivan, whose grin faded as Carter slowly pushed his chair back. The arrogance in their posture drained in an instant. They had framed many people, manipulated evidence, and walked away clean. But this wasn't just another arrest, this was a death sentence to their careers, maybe even their freedom. Reynolds stormed into the precinct floor, his voice cutting through the noise. The room tensed as officers turned their heads. Daniels stood rigidly by his desk, waiting for the explosion. Reynolds ordered Carter and Sullivan into his office, slamming the door behind them. The silence outside was deafening. Officers exchanged glances, murmurs spreading like wildfire. Nobody knew exactly what was happening, but the shift in the room was palpable. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Carter tried to feign confidence, but Reynolds wasn't playing games. He laid down the facts, his voice low but forceful. They had just arrested the most powerful law enforcement officer in the country. The charges they had fabricated wouldn't hold. The evidence would be torn apart, and their entire operation would be exposed. He gave them one chance: come clean, find a way to mitigate the damage, or sink with the ship. Sullivan broke first. His usual bravado cracked under the pressure. He tried to justify the arrest, spinning half-truths, but Reynolds wasn't buying it. Carter remained silent, his mind racing. There had to be a way out. Maybe if they doubled down, buried the truth before it could spread. He reached for his phone, fingers itching to call a contact higher up, someone who could make this all go away. But as he glanced through the one-way mirror at Amara sitting calmly in the cell, he felt the first seed of real fear take root. The precinct's doors burst open. A group of sharply dressed agents entered with practiced authority. The entire station fell into a stunned hush as the lead agent produced his badge and spoke with cold precision. They were here for Amara Johnson. The room tensed as reality set in. There was no covering this up, no rewriting the narrative. The FBI had arrived, and the reckoning was just beginning. Carter's heart pounded as he looked at Sullivan, then at Reynolds, then back at the door. There was no time left to maneuver. The walls were closing in. Officers began stepping away from them, as if their mere proximity to Carter and Sullivan might implicate them. The two men who once held control over so many fates now found themselves at the mercy of forces far beyond their reach. Inside the holding cell, Amara slowly stood as the lock clicked open. Her eyes met Carter's through the one-way mirror just before she stepped out into the open, her expression unreadable. He had thought he had the upper hand. Now, he was just another man who had underestimated the wrong woman. The game was over, and she had already won. The tension inside the precinct thickened as conflicting interests clashed. The officers involved in the arrest sensed an approaching storm, though they still believed they had control. Whispers spread among the ranks, some officers already questioning the legitimacy of the arrest, while others doubled down, unwilling to let go of the lie they had created. The air turned electric when an unmarked black SUV pulled up in front of the station. Inside, a team of FBI agents, led by a steely-eyed senior officer, prepared to make their move. Orders had already been relayed, and every operative inside that vehicle knew the magnitude of what was about to unfold. It was not just about freeing one of their own, it was about exposing a system that had rotted from the inside. Inside the precinct, tension reached a boiling point. Some officers had begun reviewing body cam footage, others nervously checking their phones as messages poured in from sources outside. The name Amara Johnson was beginning to circulate among law enforcement groups online. Some knew exactly who she was. Others still thought she was just another suspect. The desk sergeant's face drained of color when the front doors burst open, and the first agent stepped inside. Their presence commanded silence. Every officer turned to watch as the team moved with military precision. The senior agent in charge locked eyes with the precinct captain, a man who had spent his entire career avoiding situations like this. The captain's voice faltered as he attempted to assert authority. He demanded an explanation for this invasion, but the lead agent simply handed him a sealed directive from the Department of Justice. The words were clear. Amara Johnson was to be released immediately. Every piece of evidence related to her arrest was to be turned over to the FBI. An internal affairs investigation was officially underway. Inside the holding cell, Amara sat motionless, her expression unreadable. She had spent hours enduring the petty intimidation tactics of officers who thought they had power over her. She had counted their steps, memorized their faces, and observed every mistake they made. She knew their confidence was already cracking. When the lock clicked and the door swung open, Amara met the eyes of the agent standing before her. Without a word, she stepped out, her posture unwavering, her composure unchanged. She walked through the station, past officers who now avoided her gaze, past the ones who had laughed at her only hours before. Some whispered under their breath. Others simply stared, realization dawning on them that the tables had turned. Meanwhile, in a back office, the officers responsible for the arrest scrambled to salvage what they could. They shredded documents, deleted files, and made frantic phone calls. But it was too late. The FBI had already accessed the precinct system remotely. Every deleted file had already been recovered. Every altered report had been flagged. The interrogation room that had once held Amara was now occupied by the two arresting officers. They sat across from the very same FBI agent who had ordered her release. The balance of power had shifted entirely. Their arrogance had been replaced by fear. The evidence was laid out before them: tampered footage, planted substances, falsified reports. The lead agent's voice was calm, almost indifferent, as he explained the severity of the charges they now faced. They were given one chance to cooperate. One opportunity to lessen their inevitable downfall. Their silence was no longer an option. Outside, as Amara exited the precinct, the weight of the night's events settled in. She had faced worse before. She knew this fight was far from over. But as the first news vans arrived, as the story began to spread, she also knew this was more than just a personal battle. It was the beginning of something far bigger. Inside the precinct, the chaos continued. Officers whispered among themselves, wondering who would be next. Internal affairs agents arrived, prepared to conduct their own investigation. The captain, who had once scoffed at the idea of accountability, now realized his career might not survive the scandal. In the end, the truth had come for them, faster and more brutally than they had ever expected. And Amara Johnson, the woman they had tried to frame, had walked out stronger than ever. The courtroom was packed, tension thick in the air. The prosecution and defense were set, with reporters filling the gallery, their pens poised for what was about to unfold. The judge presided, his expression unreadable, while the accused officers sat rigidly, their lawyers whispering hurried strategies. At the center of it all was the woman they had tried to frame, Amara Johnson, FBI director, her gaze calm but razor-sharp. The prosecutor wasted no time, laying out the timeline of the case with precision. The illegal stop, the fabricated charges, the falsified reports. One by one, he dismantled the officer's narrative, each revelation tightening the noose around their defense. The defense attorneys tried to intervene, object, redirect, but the momentum was against them. Then came the first shock: the body cam footage. Unedited, unaltered, raw. The jury watched as the officers' casual malice played out on screen. Their arrogance, their certainty that no one would challenge their power, was now their undoing. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the damning exchange played. "She doesn't look like much. Just book her and move on. No one's going to question it. Who's going to believe her over us?" The officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Their lawyers scrambled, whispering furiously, but the damage was done. The prosecution introduced the second piece of evidence: phone records. Text messages between the officers revealed a pattern: coordinated stops, targeted victims, planted evidence. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was systemic. Their defense crumbled further. And then the coup de grace. A witness was called: Officer James Keller. He had hesitated at first, wrestling with his loyalty, his fear. But standing before the court now, under oath, he made his choice. He confirmed everything. The lies. The planted drugs. The culture of corruption. His voice never wavered as he recounted the truth. The officers glared, their expressions dark with silent threats, but Keller stood firm. The jury's faces were grim. The judge's eyes held a weight that signaled how deeply this case had shaken the system. The defense knew they were losing. Their final strategy was desperation, attacking Amara herself. They painted her as manipulative, someone using her status to turn a routine stop into a national scandal. But Amara had anticipated this. With quiet confidence, she addressed the court. She spoke of the countless cases like hers, of victims without her resources, her position, her ability to fight back. She exposed the deeper rot in the system, how it enabled officers like these to act without fear of consequences. She made it clear, this trial wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced. The courtroom was silent as she finished. The weight of her words hung in the air. The defense had nothing left. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty. On all counts. The officers' faces were masks of disbelief as reality crashed down on them. Their reign of unchecked power was over. The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed to file breaking news. Some in the gallery wept, others cheered. Justice had been served. As Amara stepped outside, cameras flashed, microphones thrust toward her. But she didn't speak. She had said all she needed to in court. Instead, she walked away, knowing this was only the beginning. The system was shaken, but the fight was far from over. In the days that followed, the fallout was immense. Investigations opened into other officers, policy changes were demanded, and the nation watched as a reckoning unfolded. But for Amara, the victory was personal and collective. She had exposed the truth. And in doing so, she had ensured that justice, for once, had prevailed. But deep down, she knew this was just one battle. The war was far from over. And she was ready for whatever came next. The verdict sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, cameras flashing as the judge's gavel slammed down. The two disgraced officers sat motionless, their faces pale, while the prosecution team exchanged knowing glances. The truth had been exposed, and now, the consequences would unfold. The Department of Justice moved swiftly. The Arlington Police Department faced an immediate federal review, with Internal Affairs launching an extensive probe into past misconduct. Officers who had once operated with impunity now found themselves under scrutiny, their actions dissected by investigators eager to dismantle the corrupt system that had shielded them for so long. Amara Johnson stood before the press, the weight of the case still heavy on her shoulders. She had fought battles before, but this was different. This wasn't just about her, it was about every Black American who had been silenced by an unjust system. She knew the implications of her case would stretch far beyond the courtroom. As the press conference began, journalists fired questions. Some asked about the trial, others about the future of policing in America. Amara met each inquiry with unshaken resolve, her voice steady and unwavering. She demanded accountability, not just for the two officers who had framed her, but for every officer who had abused their power under the guise of law enforcement. In response to the case, the Department of Justice announced a series of reforms. New oversight committees were formed, tasked with reviewing police conduct and ensuring that racial bias would no longer go unchecked. Training programs on de-escalation and bias recognition were mandated nationwide. The Amara Johnson Act was introduced in Congress, aiming to hold law enforcement accountable with stricter guidelines on body camera usage, transparency in misconduct investigations, and harsher penalties for officers who falsified evidence. Meanwhile, in the Arlington Police Department, tensions ran high. Officers who had once aligned themselves with Carter and Sullivan now feared for their careers. Whispers filled the halls, and internal division grew. Some officers, like Keller, saw this as a turning point, an opportunity to rebuild trust with the community. Others viewed it as a betrayal, believing the system had turned against them. The chief of police, under immense public pressure, resigned, leaving a fractured department scrambling for leadership. Carter and Sullivan, now facing lengthy prison sentences, sat in a holding cell awaiting transfer. Their downfall had been swift, their power stripped away in mere days. They had built careers on manipulation and fear, believing they were untouchable. Now, they were nothing more than cautionary tales, examples of what happened when corruption met its reckoning. In the community, the impact of the trial resonated deeply. Protests turned into rallies for reform. Families who had lost loved ones to police brutality found renewed hope that the system could change. Leaders emerged, calling for greater civilian oversight and demanding that every officer be held accountable for their actions. Amara, though victorious, knew the battle was far from over. She returned to her office, the weight of responsibility still heavy. Her team had already begun preparing for the next steps: policy reform, further investigations, and a push for justice in other cases that had gone ignored for too long. She was no longer just the FBI director who had been wrongfully accused. She had become a symbol of change, a force that could no longer be silenced. Weeks later, Congress debated the Amara Johnson Act. The hearings were tense, with law enforcement unions pushing back, claiming the bill would weaken police authority. Amara testified before the Senate, her words cutting through political deflections like a blade. She recounted her experience, the systemic failures, and the undeniable evidence of corruption. The world had seen what had happened to her. Now, it was time for real change. Months passed, and reforms took shape. Some departments resisted, clinging to old methods, but the momentum was undeniable. Arlington saw a complete overhaul, with new leadership and increased community involvement in police oversight. Other cities followed, adopting stricter policies and increasing transparency. For Carter and Sullivan, their fate was sealed. Their sentencing was broadcasted nationwide, serving as both a warning and a statement. No one was above the law. They had exploited the system, but the system had fought back. As they were led away in handcuffs, the finality of their actions set in. Amara, watching from her office, allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. Justice had prevailed, but the work was far from over. She picked up a new case file, ready to continue the fight. The road ahead was long, but she was prepared. The country had changed, and she had been part of that transformation. This was just the beginning. The courtroom had long emptied, but its echoes lingered. The case that started as an injustice had unraveled an entire system of corruption, deceit, and unchecked power. Amara Johnson stood outside the courthouse, the weight of the trial lifting off her shoulders, but leaving behind a deeper burden, the responsibility to ensure that this moment led to real change. The fallout of the case spread rapidly. News networks replayed footage of the exposed conspiracy, the fabricated charges, and the orchestrated cover-ups. Public outrage intensified. People took to the streets, demanding reform. The FBI issued a public statement, reinforcing their commitment to justice, vowing to dismantle institutional corruption within law enforcement agencies across the nation. It was a victory, but it was also just the beginning. For Amara, this case was personal. It wasn't just about her own exoneration, it was about every person who had been wrongfully accused, every innocent life upended by those who misused their power. She had fought her battle, but the war was far from over. Back at FBI headquarters, the ripple effect of the case was evident. The Internal Affairs Division was working overtime, reviewing past cases, cross-referencing reports for inconsistencies. Agents who had once turned a blind eye were now forced to confront their complicity. Some resigned in disgrace. Others were terminated outright. The highest levels of government were forced to respond to the public outcry, initiating a series of federal oversight measures designed to prevent another case like Amara's from happening again. Amara sat at her desk, scanning over a report detailing recommended changes in police procedure. Enhanced body camera regulations, an independent review board, mandatory de-escalation training, all steps in the right direction. But systemic change wasn't about policy alone. It was about culture, about breaking down the deep-seated biases that allowed power to go unchecked for so long. Meanwhile, the officers who had orchestrated the frame-up faced their own reckoning. Mark Whitaker, the lead officer responsible for falsifying the evidence, sat in an interrogation room, his face pale, his bravado long gone. The once confident officer now realized he was on the other side of the system he had abused. The charges against him and his accomplices were extensive, ranging from obstruction of justice to civil rights violations. The Department of Justice was making an example out of them. Some officers, those who had suspected wrongdoing but remained silent, wrestled with their conscience. A few stepped forward, providing testimony that further solidified the prosecution's case. Others maintained their silence, hoping to evade scrutiny. But the culture of silence was breaking, and that alone was a victory. Beyond the legal battles, the case had ignited something larger. Communities that had long distrusted law enforcement found a renewed sense of purpose. Advocacy groups pushed harder than ever, using Amara's case as a catalyst for broader criminal justice reform. What had started as one woman's fight for justice had become a nationwide movement. Amara knew that the change she sought would not come overnight. But as she watched the headlines, saw the growing conversations, and felt the shift in the air, she knew that this moment was a turning point. She had faced her oppressors in their own system, exposed them for what they were, and emerged stronger. Sitting in her office, she took a deep breath. A new case file rested on her desk, another battle, another fight for justice. She reached for it, knowing that her work was far from over. Because for every injustice exposed, there was always another lurking in the shadows, waiting to be challenged. And she was ready.